So it's a pleasure to host, well, it's a pleasure to moderate the panel with these four incredible women who I've had the pleasure of knowing now for multiple years in the course of my time at the U. My name is Katharine Lusk. For those who don't know me, I serve as the co-director of the Boston University Initiative on Cities down the road at 75 Bay State Road. Come and visit us if you haven't had a chance to work with us before and you are deeply passionate about urban issues and urban populations. But today we are here to talk about pushing boundaries, women scientists at the forefront of community engaged research. I'm going to do brief bio introductions, and then we have some questions laid out to have this really be a conversation among the panelists. And then because it's an intimate crowd by design, we welcome questions from the audience along the way. So first, we are joined, let me go in order. First, we are joined by Lucy Hutyra, a professor of Earth and Environment in CAS, and a national leader in measuring and modeling urban greenhouse gas fluxes and advancing our understanding of carbon cycling in cities. She's also the interim faculty director with me at the Initiative on Cities this year. Hooray! And co-director of the BU Urban Climate Initiative with Pat Kinney, associate director of BU Urban with Pam and John, and co-lead of the BU Campus Climate Lab. She is joined by Patricia Fabian, an associate professor of environmental health. Patricia's research combines expertise in housing, indoor air, respiratory infectious disease transmission, GIS, and system sciences thinking. And together with Madeleine, she's co-directs a study of heat exposure and heat vulnerability in the cities of Chelsea and East Boston, which I'm sure we will talk about. To her right is Pam Templer, a professor of biology and director of the BU Urban Doctoral Program, and I'm sure we have students in the room. Pam is a biogeochemist who's published widely on the effects of air pollution, climate change, and urbanization on forest ecosystems, water, and air quality. And lastly, we have Madeleine Scammell, an associate professor of environmental health as well. She's an expert in community-driven and community-based participatory research and leads community engagement cores for the BU Superfund Research Center and the BU Harvard Center for Research on Social and Environmental Stressors in Housing Across the Life course. Okay, so this is both a methods and a career discussion, so everyone can feel free to ask questions about either lane, and I'm going to as well. And we're really here to talk about pushing boundaries in research, as well as pushing boundaries as women scientists. So the first question that everyone has been prompted with, and I'm going to start with Madeleine, tell us how community engagement is part of your research. And in answering the question, reveal to us the focus of your research.
Okay. In 10 seconds. Okay. So personally, I have always sought only to do research in response to questions that arose from the community. And typically I've tried to work with environmental justice communities, taking the definition of the Massachusetts environmental justice policy, low-income communities of color. And so pretty much all of my research on urban heat islands, on chronic kidney disease in Central America, has some community engagement. But you can tell me like if I'm getting lost. But I started actually at BU as a graduate student and a full-time staff person with the Superfund Research Program Community Engagement Core. And then, as you said, I've led the community engagement cores of several research centers, a CDC-funded prevention research center, an NIEHS-funded Superfund Research Center, and I prefer, maybe you'll talk about this afterwards, but I prefer the term participatory research or community-based participatory research or community-driven research to describe what I do. Not so much community-engaged research, but maybe we can come back to that.
Before we move on to you, tell me what a community engagement core is.
Thank you. If you have a research center, it typically has 3 to 5 studies, core projects that drive the research of the center. And the idea of funding a center is that there'd be integration across disciplines, across projects. And centers typically have cores that provide services to and assist the research projects. And not all of them have community engagement cores. that centers I worked on did, but they typically have like bioanalytics cores or statistics cores or bioinformatics, exposure assessment, depending on the center.
And who underwrites community engagement?
So usually the community engagement core requirement is part of the request for applications published by the funding agency, CDC, EPA, NIH, and once I was part of a center program response where we included a community engagement core even though it wasn't required. And I think that pushed the boundary a bit to say, in our center, we really want to have a community engagement core. We think it's essential to our research, even though it's not required. Hopefully you'll consider it as valuable as, say, a statistics core.
So rather than going health, natural science, I'm gonna stick with health and turn to you next, Patricia. And I'm wondering, can you also answer the question? Tell us about the role that community engagement has played in your research and reveal to us a little bit more about the nature of your work.
Sounds good. So I work with Madeleine, co-director project. I actually come from a very different path. I'm an engineer. I studied industrial engineering, which is about manufacturing. And I studied environmental engineering, which was about measuring fungi and bacteria in flooded homes. And then the reason I actually studied public health eventually is because it was really fun to solve technical problems, but at some point there was a disconnect between what happened to humans. That still doesn't get me to community, right? That just got me to connecting to people and kind of what the health impacts are. And so I think it's been a slow journey from a very technical field into, how does this impact health? And then, okay, well, health are people and we should be doing more work in communities. So it's actually been a sort of very different path, I would say, than Madeleine. And I've learned a lot from her as well. It's part of this CHEAT project. So CHEAT is a study in Chelsea and East Boston that's about building resilience to extreme heat. A lot of vulnerable populations live in these two communities, so it's been fun actually to merge kind of the technical and the community and try to come up with ideal solutions. I also do a lot of system science modeling, thinking about housing and indoor air and lung function and asthma. And there it really has been more about how can we use these models and apply them in useful ways for communities to make decisions, really more around things coming down the pipeline like decarbonization initiatives for housing.
So give me some specific examples of how the community has been involved in the work.
Well, CHEAT, which again, Madeleine and I co-direct, there's multiple pieces to that. So one is obviously strong linkages with community organizations. And I will say super important to line up the objectives and goals of the community organization that you're working with. I don't know if we'll get to that later, but with what you're trying to do, because I have worked on other projects where we had a community engagement core, super fantastic community organization. Their goals were education and ours were environmental work. And so it was really hard to sort of get very far in terms of doing anything useful on both ends, right? Or sort of you listen to what the needs are, but if it's about education and what you're doing is environment. So I think what I do now is right with Green Roots, again with Madeleine and Chelsea, and it's a climate justice organization. And so a lot of what we're doing is about climate and environmental justice. We co-wrote a grant where we got funding that a big portion of that is for funding the community organization and hiring someone into, like helping support, I guess, a climate justice organizer. Certainly training, right, people and sort of doing like recruitment and things like that. We have a quantitative component, which is about measurement, which is what we do, right? We're environmental, still an environmental engineer at heart. But then it's paired with something called photo voice, where what we're doing is talking to people and learning about their experiences of heat. And then linking that with the data.
So you've got, okay, so I want to make sure, because this is a question for both of you.
Yeah, really.
So you brought a community organization to the table. That's in this case, in CHEAT, you brought a community organization to the table and you co-wrote the grant proposal, which is not about research methods, right? That's really about like what does true community partnership look like? So and then you within the grant have funding, is that right, for staff? Mm-hmm. And then there's a discussion of methods. And so can you talk a little bit more about, did I miss anything? And then can you talk a little bit more about some of the methods that you're employing? Because I think I know them, and so I want to make you talk about them, or probably for those who don't know about them. What are some of the ways in which community residents in particular, or green roots and representatives from green roots are sort of actively involved in the work, either as research subjects or as researchers?
Oh,
Go for
sure.
it.
Okay. I think one of our questions is, where are the urban heat islands, or the hot pockets, as Victor says, in the city of Chelsea? The city is itself an urban heat island, but it's not homogeneous. It's not the same all over. There are big differences. So starting with asking residents, our community partners and members of the organization, where do you think we should put monitors that are going to measure temperature, and talk through the differences between ambient temperature and surface temperature, which was actually very relevant in our study because people complained about using the slides or the benches or even going into parks that are super hot. And that's not so much about the ambient temperature that we were planning to exclusively measure, but about the surface temperatures of the play structures. So we started a part of the study is looking at the relationship between the two. So in our discussions with the residents about their questions related to our larger research questions, we've modified and added on to research questions that are interesting to us and to them. And then there's also the aspect of our meetings functionally. It includes staff at Green Roots and BU. Like, we've been in the habit of sort of talking about our research team meetings and that they're like BU. But the pandemic has actually made it possible to have meetings on equal ground, that we're not going back and forth between our offices, that we create the space virtually, which is kind of strange, that includes each of us from all places, and it's not in one or the other. Do you want to?
Yeah, I guess one other thing to add in terms of community engagement is making sure that everyone's sitting at the table when we're talking, like say with City of Chelsea or other organizations or other initiatives, that there might be grants and work that are going on in the city, and making sure that all three voices, because everybody has different purposes and whatever their goals are, whatever their job roles are, et cetera. So if it's about a grant the city has that has specific objectives and directives, you know, as researchers might maybe have different specific games, et cetera, and then the community also, and sort of trying to line those up and making sure that the community is sitting at the table when you're having conversations with all the different stakeholders. And so that's another thing that we really push for, and I think has so far worked.
Have you yet reached the point of having findings that you're sharing back with residents? And what does that process look like? Is it only with the sort of working group or your steering committee, or are you doing direct engagement to actually have a sense-making process so that residents are engaged in trying to understand what it is you're learning?
I'd say it's a bit of a hybrid. I mean, we're still trying to make sense of the enormous amount of data we collected over the last 2 summers. So we're sharing what we can via social media about hotspots and differences between the hot and the cool places in the city, or the use of hydration stations. And the youth have really taken some of that data that they collected and put it out there, which engages the larger community in sharing some of our findings. But I think when we've shared everything that we have with our advisory team and the community partners, but in terms of the larger community, I'd say we're open to ideas.
This will also be brainstorming.
Yeah.
No, the other thing is we are in the middle of the grant and in the middle of work,
Yes,
right?
right.
We just finished the summer collecting data.
Right.
Super important to be transparent with the data and to make sure that the data you have is good quality. And if anybody's done work taking measurements, you know that sometimes the sensor breaks, sometimes, you know, the batteries die, et cetera. So I would say we're still sort of in the middle of the process. Today we had a great meeting where here's all our data, it's clean. Okay, what are the next set of meetings and stakeholders that we need to meet with to say who cares about playgrounds, who cares about the bus stops, who cares about the heat islands, who cares about the cool block, who cares about the empty lot that's going to be turned into a green space. And so this is kind of where we are next. More to come,
Yeah.
I'd say, in a couple months.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Patricia, Pam, So I want to turn to you. So give us a sense, take us inside your work, and give us a sense of the role of community engagement. Sort of how do you conceive of it? We talked about a lot of different potential touch points between the researcher and the community and different ways of working. Talk to us about what it means in your field and what it's been in your work.
Sure. So first of all, I'm just going to say it's amazing to be in a room with all of you. It's just incredible. So it's great to see all of you, and thank you for organizing this. This is amazing. I come from the field of biogeoscience, like Lucy, and I'd say for a while now, there's been this desire to understand how humans impact the environment. So like what we study in our lab is how does climate change impact forests, ability to filter our water and our air, or how does urbanization affect tree cover, things like that. And so that was like a huge revolutionary thing when people went from just studying trees to like how do humans impact trees. That transition was happening when I was in grad school. Like, oh, you're including humans? Because back then ecologists were like going to Africa or the wilds of Alaska. That was considered the gold standard of basic natural science. And then there was this recognition that, oh, you actually have to include humans in there. So for many years, I looked at that one-way connection of how do humans impact the environment. And over time, you know, the box in my slides were always very detailed about the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle in forests. And then there was always this arrow out to negative impacts on human health. And I didn't study that box at all. And it was part of, over time, a frustration of not understanding how it in turn impacts humans in detail that helped us start the urban program. So that's when we originally started writing grant proposals, mostly from this campus with biogeoscience, and then recognizing that we really need to get to know these guys and many people in this room, Greg and Pat and others, to understand the full circle of how humans are impacting the environment, how that in turn impacts human health and human well-being. So I think what Madeleine and Patricia are doing is the gold standard of, what did you call it, participatory-based research? Community-based participatory research. I'd say in my work, it's not as intimate, I think, intimately linked. So we've done things like, we have a grant at Hubbard Brook where we do a lot of research in New Hampshire. It's about public engagement with science, but it's more about bringing people to the table to say, as forest ecologists, what's important to you? So we've had people from the timber industry, the fishing industry. These are all people from rural New Hampshire, so not cities, so very different. And they've come and said, we need to know, like, with a smaller snowpack and more freezing, what do we need to do with our culverts so they don't break in the wintertime because we're tired of our basements flooding. We're tired of our roads buckling when a hurricane comes through. That's the kind of information they need, which is not what I study. So it's been really interesting to learn what they want to know and that they need people like Patricia who are engineers. So that's been a little bit of a learning lesson there. And then I'd say more recently I don't know if this counts in this area, but working with policymakers. So I did an internship a while back in Senator Moynihan's office in Washington, D.C. I've worked with the state now on their roadmap, their global warming roadmap to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and just trying to work with cities through the urban program, like we've worked with the city of Boston. Lucy and I have worked with Carl Spector, the commissioner of the environment, and I'll never forget this story. It's like so impactful that Lucy and I went downtown. We shared our awesome results about nitrogen deposition in Boston, showing that it was elevated, and we were all like, woohoo, look at these exciting results, you gotta do something about it. And he's like, yeah, what about the phosphorus? And so we're like, oh, we're not measuring phosphorus because it doesn't fall from the sky. Like, don't you know it's not in deposition? But we went back to BU and right away told Steve Ticina, the student we jointly advised, like, Steve, do you still have those samples? Let's just for fun, let's just humor him, measure the phosphorus. And we found really high amounts of phosphorus in the deposition, and that's opened up a whole new area of work. So it's not like directly benefiting people in the city of Boston, but I'd like to think in the big picture, if we can now contribute to the understanding that it is falling from the sky, and that if you want to understand water quality in Boston Harbor and eutrophication, potential harmful algal blooms that impact people, this is important. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool.
I didn't want to stop you, but I'm curious about your interactions from the forest. What did those interactions look like? So Carl, I'm imagining, right, you went downtown, you went to Carl's office, you sat in front of him, you did a PowerPoint presentation. Are you bringing stakeholders into the forest? Like, how are you engaging this sort of much more general audience in New Hampshire?
So we call them roundtable events. So we literally bring them to the forest, and they're welcome to go on tours, but usually we're in a big room, in like the big conference center there. And we literally have talks given by us, by them, and then a lot of brainstorming together on like, what are you looking for? What do you need? The really cool thing is in the past, it was mostly like professionals who were invited, like not Mass Audubon, New Hampshire Audubon, Nature Conservancy, and someone came up with the idea in the last few years to bring literally the people who live down the road. So now the neighbors of Hubbard Brook on this small rural road in New Hampshire, so Mirror Lake Road, for those of you who work up there, literally this older couple just comes to all the meetings now. And the idea, that all started because the director of a different place, the Carey Institute, happened to go to a bar near Hubbard Brook and was like, what do you think of Hubbard Brook down the road? And they're like, what's that? And that's what started a whole conversation of, you people need to bring in locals. Like, your neighbors need to know what you're doing. So it's like sitting around tables and chit-chatting.
Great. So Lucy, let's turn to you. Give us a sense, how has community engagement been a part of your work?
Completely different than what they just described. Completely different story. So I have zero training in the social sciences, like none. I don't know how to talk to people. I measure gas fluxes, and I spent most of my career measuring gas fluxes. And after I finished my PhD, which was based in the Central Amazon, I really wanted to do something that wasn't in a country where I didn't fully understand the culture and was getting asked to make all these comments about land use policies that I knew nothing about land use policies at that point. But those questions kept resonating with me, and I took every single method that I learned and started working on it in cities. And I saw, in my mind, an application of measuring gas concentrations in air, fluxes of these gases, to climate actions that people were starting to talk about. And how I've engaged with the community is very different. I co-led a big effort that brought a whole bunch of super geeky technical scientists that don't ever talk to communities together, but had very strong technical skills and a desire to measure greenhouse gases in cities, together with NGOs and policymakers from cities and agencies and different government agencies. And we ran a program for 3 years trying to have a conversation about, what data do you need? What data do you have? And, well, how can you use that data? Well, let's talk about uncertainty. And then the scientists would go down a rabbit hole, and we'd lose everybody else in the room where they did not have an interest in uncertainty. They wanted an answer. And that was the beginning of a completely different trajectory for me in the work that we were doing, to think about, what do communities actually need to know, as opposed to what do we know how to measure? And I've had so many failures of, I know how to measure this. Let me tell you about this really cool thing. And nobody cares. Nobody in the city cares, because it's either not a hot topic moment of now, or there's no policy dimension around it, or the community is not interested in it. As interesting as I think it is, they may not think it's interesting. And so as the years have gone on, it's become much more of a series of relationships with different stakeholders and city officials, and conversations of, what do you need to know that you don't know? And then ideas of, I might know how to measure that, I might know how to model that, or I might know a person that knows how to. And so it's been a very different approach. My group has done some work with community groups, but we've done much more work with city officials and NGO officials and kind of groups that are working at that level. But it's been a lot of failure getting towards a different way of communicating and listening.
Pam touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering about, and maybe there's a compare and contrast here between the natural sciences and public health as well. How was the decision to get involved in community engaged research received by peers? And has the reception been constant? You know, Pam, you mentioned this was like, there was the frontier when you got started, which is just about human interaction with the natural world and the impact of the natural world on humans. but actually engaging with different constituencies from the public. How has that been received in your field? And is there a perception then and a perception now, or is it pretty much the same?
I could
Go for it.
I'd say there's a duality to it. So, and Lucy, I would love your input on this from the natural sciences side. If you do policy relevant work and you engage, then you're seen as an expert and like good for you. Then the flip side is what we call in our field citizen science, which is, it seems very similar where it's more like bringing people in who aren't trained scientists to help you with the science, not necessarily benefiting them. And sometimes that's seen as wonderful, like great, you're involving the community. And sometimes it's seen as great, but the quality probably won't be as good, but yeah, do it anyway, which I think is not fair because you can train people. So I think my sense is, especially in environmental health, human health, it's much more mission driven, and like you can go in with a bias that's acceptable. Like we want to improve human health, no one will argue with that. Lucy and I think are held to a different standard of you must go in objective and you don't know what you're going to find, and you can't advocate for a position because that compromises your objectivity. So I feel like there's a duality in our field of like get engaged, but be careful. Don't be seen as an advocate. And Nathan's here. At some point, I'd love to hear Nathan's take on this too, because it's tough, I think, sometimes for natural scientists.
I totally agree. I think in the last decade plus, there's been an evolution in the value of doing something other than basic science among agencies like NASA or the National Science Foundation, where the impacts of the science and connecting beyond the ivory tower, if you will, were just not a priority. It was about knowledge in its purest form for a long time. And as the years have gone on, even things like grant review criteria, even for PhD fellowships, are about broader impacts. How is this work going to have an impact on society? And really recently with the Biden administration, they've taken it to another level of how do we actually use this and have a plan for that connection. And there's conflict among scientists about this because some science does not have clear societal applications. It's understanding particles. It doesn't impact policy decisions on a day-to-day basis. And that science is valuable too. But it's evolved, and I would say still evolving.
So I will say public health, you're right, is mission driven, and the mission is to improve the health of populations, right, particularly vulnerable populations. So engaging with community, I think, has always been there, but it hasn't always been there in a healthy way, I would say, because it's been, initially was sort of, we're scientists. Let's figure out what problem we have, come in and, learn something from the community, and then out we go. And I do think that is a lot of the way that community research was done in the past. Maybe still a little bit, but it's changing as it should, right? To say, well, what do you care about? What are you interested in? Not someone I was talking to the other side, like we're not giving voice to communities. Communities have a voice, right? It's about creating collaborations and saying, I'm a scientist, this is what I have to offer, right? Like, you're a community member, this is what you have to offer, and how can we get to a better place together? So yes, definitely community always been part of it, but I think that it's improving and changed a lot in the last 10 years to really be more meaningful and long-term and not just about the science that matters for the scientist. So.
I agree. I think that so I just have to acknowledge Pat Penny there, who I learned about a study he did with high school kids in New York City where they wore backpacks with particulate matter monitors on them from an article in Science magazine in 1995. and that was when you were at Columbia, and we met soon after that. But I think there's always been an incentive to engage communities and support. I only applied to one graduate school, and it was BU School of Public Health. And I only wanted to do community engaged work. And if I didn't get in, I wasn't going to go to graduate school. I was just going to figure out how else to do my life. And I think However, there are pressures of funding and funding mechanisms. So we had 2 centers in our department with community engagement cores. We have none right now. So the commitment to actually doing research with strong community engagement will be challenged. And we need to institutionalize some of those practices independent of external funding sources that support some faculty and not others to do community engaged work. Otherwise, it's just going to go up and down with all the trends, and we aren't all going to be trained the same to do equal quality work.
It's not a metric we're evaluated on.
So right. So that's where I want to go next. So if this is a career question now, right? So there's money, publications, and tenure, and career fulfillment. Which
Tenure?
sorry, not universally applied. Not all 4 apply to everybody necessarily. And so I wonder, can you guys touch on each of those, right? So if you're talking to students who have an opportunity in the course of their careers to decide and elect to do community engagement research, potentially in the face of some resistance, tell me a little bit about those 4 things. I mean, for you guys, does it impact tenure positively or negatively? Lucy, you touched a little bit on funding and that the funding agencies and priorities, and I've seen it from NSF, the priorities of funding agencies are changing. And then there's the publication avenue. Are there as many opportunities to talk about methods and community engagement methods in the natural sciences and public health? And then just personal fulfillment. I mean, what does it really mean to you to be interacting with the people who are either contending with the adverse harm from the things you're studying? You're not the source of the harm, but the things you're studying are harmful, and are potential beneficiaries of some of the things that you're learning. Does anyone want to comment on any of those 4? You don't each have to comment on all of them, but I'm just curious.
I'll take the tenure one.
Okay, go for it.
I think it's really hard to do early in your career because at least the kind of engagements that I've pursued have taken so much time because it's about relationships. It's about building relationships, building trust, fostering those, showing some capacity to deliver, and it's time consuming. And that time isn't easily reflected on your CV. And in the tenure clock, which may seem very long, but it's not that long, considering the time it takes to get a project conceived, funded, executed, published. And the metric you're primarily evaluated on is your teaching and publications and your standing in the scientific community. And that community engagement doesn't necessarily come out clearly in that. And I think it's tough because so much of it is about early reputation building, and you get tenure for having an impact, a scholarly impact. I don't know how we fix the system, but the current system does not reward that community engagement, that science policy exchange. The mechanisms are not there to even see it on the things that are being evaluated.
I can add to that. So I agree with Lucy, but I do think it's changing.
It is changing.
Yeah, so like National Science Foundation in the United States, they used to never fund this work, and now some of their biggest granting opportunities require a participatory component of research. Not all of them by any means, but there's more and more of them. And now with Biden and environmental justice being a big component of his push, I think tenure, and just so those of you who are not familiar, Lucy and I are from this campus where tenure exists for faculty. Patricia and Madeleine are on the School of Public Health at the medical campus where tenure doesn't exist. That's, just so you know, so you understand where that came from. But I would say with tenure, promotion, whatever it is, because the federal agencies are now recognizing it, I think we're going to see more of it because there's the cost that Lucy said. It's relationship building, which is so slow compared to other things. We are starting to get rewarded for it. And as soon as NSF funds it, the EU recognizes it, right? All you need to do is put a grant on your CV and you're good. Write some papers. Now there's more interdisciplinary journals. there are challenges with them, but they exist, which they did not exist 20 years ago. So I do think it's slow, but it's increasing.
And one of the big things that you're evaluated on for promotion is letters. You get external letters are solicited, and those letters are almost exclusively from other professors at universities like this one. One thing that could certainly help reflect the value and the impact of the science that's being done is to let letters come from a broader suite of constituencies on what the impact of the work is.
Yeah.
Because it won't come out in your H factor, or it might not come out in your H factor, or it might not come out in your H factor for a decade.
Does everyone know what an H factor is? What's your H factor? Yes, okay.
It's how many citations your papers are garnering.
I don't like to assume anyone knows every term that ever gets referenced, so, okay.
But those sorts of changes could at least be something that is part of a record of evaluation for an individual that places value on the time that it does require.
And it's something that has been documented in various instances about some of the ways that higher ed could change. And I think it might be Cal Poly, for tenure cases, they've integrated a social impact factor into the tenure. Don't quote me that it's Cal Poly, but it's one of the institutions I've been looking at, and they have integrated social impact factor as one of the considerations in the tenure process. I know which institution it is, and I can tell you after. Anyone else comment on if not tenure, on sort of motivators, right, and opportunities, funding landscape, journals, and professionals.
Funding landscape is a big one, right?
Yeah.
So most grants, and it's changing, NSF is changing, NH is changing as well. But there's some grants that explicitly say you cannot do any policy advocacy, you can't do any policy, your papers come out of this can't be policy. And so the challenge is that you maybe get funding from NIH or NSF to do the basic science, and then you have to go find funding in other places to do the policy work. So that is, I think, a really great opportunity for funders, right, to put in its community engagement, its policy impact, and saying this is actually valid. How do you keep that from being partisan or, so you can still believe the science, right? I'm not sure. I think that's a challenge, but I do think that at least for community engagement, that is a no-brainer, right?
I want to ask about trust, because Lucy mentioned this, and this question was coming. Trust takes time, and I have, in workshops I've run with faculty funded by NSF about community engagement, in this case in sort of smart cities, technology-oriented research. That was where there was a lot of discussion about trust takes time and change happens at the pace of trust. And so particularly in this case, it was computer scientists and engineers who similarly have no training and background necessarily in community engagement methods. There's this long process of working to establish trust in the community and also to be trustworthy and perceived as trustworthy, and then live that out in the way that you interact with the community and different stakeholders. So can you take us back to before anybody trusted you or you were known? And Madeleine, I think you're sort of a good example of how did you begin to lay the foundation of trust to be taken seriously and be respected and be a real partner in a place like Chelsea or anywhere else that you've done this work?
I spent a lot of time not saying anything, just listening and living in the community and being a member of the organization I now partner with as a researcher. I think I still struggle with representing Boston University at times because people develop trust with individuals, not institutions, and that trust can be broken really quickly. It takes years to build, and so yeah, I just am very careful, and I still live in the city where I do a lot of work, Chelsea, and it would really suck if I screwed up. In a big way. I've screwed up in a lot of little ways, but I would not want to be the person who really did something terrible and made, discredited someone in the city who I admire deeply, or took credit away because BU does a big glossy thing about me and the city, and really it's a lot of different people's work, and so you can't control everything around you, but being aware of how like the university will perceive what I'm doing and use it to their benefit versus how the community and the city views me as a resident and a member, and being true to, trying to be true to everyone.
And what is it, how do you contrast your work in Chelsea where you are a resident and a long-time individual and stakeholder in the community with places where you don't have deep roots? What does it mean to have worked in a different part of the world where there's different kinds of barriers to building trust?
Yeah, never, ever expecting people to trust me at all, ever. Like thinking that that would be amazing, but really we need to have a relationship where we ultimately, hopefully, after years would trust each other to have each other's back. But like I do work in Central America, and I'd say there are 3 people of all of the research team that I feel like we trust each other, and it's been 10 years of working together and seeing each other in different situations where we should speak with or for or stand behind the other person's interests, and yeah, like not placing your own interests first, I guess, but recognizing your shared interests.
Anyone else want to reflect on that question?
I could say a little short story that's so different. Like I learned so much from you. I never thought about that framing of like how BU wants to sell your story and how that might come into conflict. So that's really interesting. On a very different scale, so we work in rural New Hampshire, which is like a different world from Boston, 2 hours north from here. Some folks in this room know Ian Holm, the site manager for Hubbard Grove. He works for the Forest Service. So I think of that as our community there. And we've had to build trust with him, and it can be broken in a heartbeat. So a quick story is we had undergrads, we call them winter interns, who we hired to go shovel snow from our snow manipulation experiment. We had to use our snowmobile up there 5 miles out, and sometimes they break down. You got to call Ian on a cold, snowy day. Ian, can you come rescue us because it's going to get dark? And we bring candy to Ian. We like make sure to sweep out the rooms after we stay there. Like we do all these things to show our appreciation. One student, one time, said something to the effect of, "Why don't you have fancier snowmobiles?" Because he's from rural New Hampshire too. It was a joke. The months of phone calls and apologies, like I had no idea Ian would get so angry, but it was like months of like, who do your students think they are? I'm here to help them. Like the trust was broken in an instant of like, I'm here to help you guys and you do not appreciate me. And that one student's comment reflected on us as a team. And I learned from then, I have to speak to every student and explain. Folks here know this. You have to show up with respect and like earn their trust. You're not going to just get it because you're coming from the big city. If anything, they're going to be skeptical of what your interests are here. It's their forest, their land, not ours. And so that was just an example where I agree with you that you have to be so careful in these long-term relationships because you might build it up for 10 years, but it can be broken in an instant.
Yes.
I'm going to look at all of you. Are there any questions? I'm going to keep going otherwise, but I want people to pipe in.
Yeah.
Greg, go for it.
I guess, can you distinguish between sort of doing engaged research or research driven by community needs and community preferences, but it's still research versus just helping communities? Because I think when you were talking about, the sort of the university or the academy doesn't sort of recognize the value of these things, I think sometimes there's like, it's a fine line, right, between whether you're just enabling and supporting the community or you're doing research in the community. So how do you navigate that line? Because it's hard to separate the two.
Go for it. Yeah.
Thanks. This comes up a lot in like centers where there are community engagement cores, or there's like an office for community engagement, or that engagement can take many forms, like service learning, assistance, fundraising, whatever, and it's not research. And I think to do community engaged research, the engagement and the research have to be like this, And you can't leave the science to the scientists and the engagement to the rapport building person, because that's not going to work. Like the person who's on the front lines of the community needs to understand the science as well as they understand the dynamics on the ground. And it's really different to do research, all phases of the research, from deciding what the problem is, how you're going to approach it, designing the study, collecting the data, interpreting the data, and then disseminating the results. Yeah, sorry.
I can add one thing to that, is that NSF, I think they make a very clear distinction. Every proposal from graduate student fellowships on up have to have intellectual merit and broader impacts. And the community-based stuff used to only be in the broader impacts. Like, what are you doing to benefit your community or the world? And I think it's, as Lucy and I were talking about, it's the only recently in the last 2 years has the community part been put into the research part. So at least in the natural sciences, it's just starting, I think, degrees. And Nathan has an awesome NSF grant, a couple of human natural systems, where they brought humans into the infrastructure of cities. And that, before that granting opportunity came about, I don't think NSF had anything like that.
And broader impacts, as written, often was dissemination.
Right,
We
dissemination.
learned something, and now we're going to go tell these people the thing that we learned way at the end of the process. And that even in the 7 years I've been at BU, I've seen the ways faculty approach grant writing, and then the way NSF, and as a reviewer now for NSF multiple times, the things that NSF is looking for in broader impacts are much more substantive, and in intellectual merit are much more substantive, and people are much more critical when broader impact is, we're going to go send some emails out, and we're going to get some news stories, and we're going to do some, some things that aren't journal articles so that people know about what we learned. There's been a pretty significant change in that area.
I think a great example out of, my scientific community and some of the work we've done is we work in cities, right? I have a sensor on the roof of CAS. Some of my colleagues work in other big cities where the city itself has very active policies to tackle questions related to what is directly being measured in the heart of their city. The city has no idea that federal agencies have invested multi-million-dollar research projects in the middle of their city to study what they're hiring consultants to do. And then the scientists don't know what to do and have never gone to City Hall to say, hey, so we're kind of doing this thing. We don't need permission. We're doing it. You might care. But that conversation it's still, I was just at a science team call before this, and that dynamic was in play again, where it was no connection between the work happening in a place and the actual need for the work in that place. And I think it'll take some years before that evolves, and time and resources and a value, a merit value to do something different.
And I'm just going to add on that because I know the example you're thinking of, because it was one of those we've talked about. There's also the observation that you need access points on both sides, right? You need to know who the community stakeholders could be and how to work with them and how to get your foot in the door. And that whether that's showing up to a community meeting or having people with the right titles that respond to emails to go have a preliminary meeting, and that's in this case something that doesn't exist. And then the same is true of universities. We sometimes do a lousy job of being open and present and responsive when community members come to us and say, can you help me? Not just can you give me things, but can you actually help me answer this question? And you have tools and resources. And so at the Initiative on Cities, we spend a lot of time thinking about, like, how can we be the access point and be visible so that when people come to us, we can say yes, and here's who I want to direct you to. And that a lot of that happens totally behind the scenes and completely informally, but it's about being open and transparent and communicative, whether you're in government or community or at a university.
I was going to add training, because I think that most of us don't get training in those, right? So I think all of us want our work to be impactful. When I was measuring bacteria or UV disinfection of tuberculosis surrogates, I wanted it to matter. But the training I got was about how to measure UV light and how to grow bacteria, not about go talk to hospitals, go talk to homeless shelters, go see who's going to be using this, who cares about it, what things. would matter. So I do think from a university perspective, thinking about systems and changes, is that everyone should have training in community engagement, and it doesn't have to be community residents or politicians, or right, it's kind of wherever it is that your work is going to matter. We don't have that, and certainly not in basics. We didn't have it in engineering. We have little of it, I would say, even public health. Madeleine teaches a community engaged class, and there's how many classes?
One a year?
One a year, there you go, for the whole.
And one in social work.
And one in social work.
There's one in public health and one in social work. Yeah.
I do appreciate urban though, because I do think that's expanded even my idea of what is a community, what is community engagement, because it is not only with residents of specific communities, it means a lot of things.
And so Urban is a NSF training grant that we've received that has 1.5 years left in it. And Pam's the director, but I can say it's been transformative for me as a faculty member participating in it, and I've seen what it's done for the students. But it's an experiment on the part of NSF. And now we're at this fantastic crossroads of, we built this super successful, expensive thing. What do we do? How do we keep it going? And Urban is actually training students on how to do these things, the kind of training that I never received. I'm getting now as they get it. But what happens next? And what happens?
We've got like 5 more minutes left. Are there other questions? Another question around it. Go ahead.
So you spoke quite a bit of some of the challenges that exist, especially for early career scientists. And I was curious if you could speak on what advice would you give for early career scientists at different stages, like graduate student versus postdoc versus pre-tenure, especially in light of how things have rapidly changed.
I would say build relationships no matter what you're doing. There's the science. Everybody has the same 24 hours in a day, right? 7 days a week. And there's things that you do that aren't your research, but that are fun. And so whether, a lot of people do community service, other people have hobbies, maybe you go on hikes, whatever it is. You don't have to separate the engaging with community from your science. So I think saving some space in your week, every week, to do some of that and get interested in a community organization that does similar things. And it doesn't have to be science, it can be caring about trees, right? Like thinking about the Speak for the Trees project that one of my students worked on. So if you do that, right, and it's small amounts of time really, but then it's about building relationships over long periods of time. And it also doesn't take away from what you need to do to get your dissertation done, to get your postdoc papers written, to do your interviews, to get faculty jobs, etc. If you wait until all that's done and then try to build community relations and get the training, kind of a little late, you're starting from zero, right? That's one idea.
And I'll just add that, I know, Joy, you're about to start a faculty position. Just awesome, congratulations. I know not everybody wants to go into academia. So I always tell people it's never a waste of time, because hopefully you get personal enrichment, but you're also professionally networking at the same time. So maybe you'll go into academia, maybe you'll go into government, consulting, nonprofits. So all these people you're meeting, you're getting a chance to explore what they do. You're learning, do you like this, do you not? Okay, or do you want to go pursue it professionally? So I agree. Just be careful, protect your time. What is the core thing that you're responsible for? Make sure you do that. Because sometimes it could take over your life. And you have to be careful at any stage in your career not to let those things be 90%. If you have a job, but then in the extra time, let's do it.
Any other advice?
I did everything they told me not to do because I wanted to. I followed my heart on a lot of these things. It wasn't the smart thing to do. It wasn't the most strategic way to get the most papers. But it meant a lot to me, and I did it anyway. And so that's terrible advice.
And the field's starting to catch up with you, Lucy.
Can you guys expand a little bit on that? Because you're all fantastically successful, and that's the common thread I've heard amongst you. It's like this, I knew this was a bad idea, but I wanted to do it anyway. And so is that what it takes to be successful, broadly or specifically in engaged work? is sort of doing it, irrespective or maybe despite your institutional norms?
There are so many ways to be successful.
Yeah.
You could be successful never doing anything with communities. And you could be successful doing everything with communities. And if you're doing everything with communities, you may not be a professor anymore at that point, but you could be very successful. And I don't know, it was success means I published a lot of papers and I got promoted, but it's, I ended up I didn't do what was easy and keep doing tropical biogeochemistry. That was easy because it was what I had done before, but it wasn't where my heart was.
But I do agree with what Pam is saying. You have to have a core. I mean, to your point, yes, follow your heart. Don't follow your heart 100% of the time, right? Like there are core things. You work in an institution or in a job or in a consulting company or government, wherever it is that you work. There's core things that you have to do. Be strategic about the rest, is what I would say.
I guess there's a distinction, because do you feel you were perhaps discouraged from pursuing it, but not actively penalized? Or do you feel like there's times in your career where there's a difference, right? Like, or do you feel like there's times in your career where you have been penalized for electing to do a certain type of work? It seems to me that I don't know of instances for all of you where that's the case, but I don't know your full career span.
I was discouraged.
You were discouraged, but not penalized.
I was actively discouraged by mentors who I respect tremendously. Like, this is not going to help you in your career.
But they didn't stop mentoring you.
They didn't stop mentoring me because I'm so likable. But I didn't do what they said.
Yeah.
And as time went on, and there was a success to show for it, and the NSF and the value structure of broader impacts evolved, all of a sudden, I was like the only person that knew how to interact with communities. And then it became an asset.
I appreciate you saying that we're fantastically successful, Greg. I think the pushing boundaries is apropos because I feel like I'm always pushing the edges of what is allowable or considered acceptable, and maybe I've never been penalized, but it did take me a really long time to finish my doctorate. It took me longer than usual to become promoted to associate professor. And, just those milestones that have costs, but I'm fine with it. Really, I'm fine.
So I want to close with one question, and I have put this in here, and I do want us to end with it because I want to look ahead. When it comes to community research partnerships, what do you think the next decade will bring? And this is a speed round, so you each have to say something really brief. I'm going to start. My hope is that in the next decade, BU will have what Penn State has, which is a certificate in engineering and community engagement, or a certificate in community engagement, and that any one of our students can get explicit expertise in community engaged research methods. So that's what I would like to see over the next. So it could be what you expect to see or what you'd like to see. Speed round. Who wants to go? Go. Speed round. What would you expect to see or you'd like to see in relation to community engagement?
Much more diversity in terms of who is considered a student and a researcher, and that the divide between community and academia is more of a bridge.
Yeah, training, whether it's a certificate or something else, just more explicit how to. So many people have the desire, just don't know how to do it.
For students and faculty?
Absolutely.
Everybody?
Yeah.
Great.
I would say integrated funding, which is not just about the science, but that all grants come with a community engagement and impact funding stream.
Funny. Love it.
I want all of that, but institutionalized, where there's actual mechanisms and dollars and value from universities to pay for it, so that we're not scraping together 3-year grant after 3-year grant with the gaps in between to try to maintain the work and the relationships.
Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you so much.